Video games are rife with post-apocalyptic wastelands, and fittingly, Rage 2 feels incredibly familiar. Nothing like its predecessor, thank goodness. Rage 2 instead feels like a dozen other open-world games rolled into one, but with some particularly fun shooting mechanics to set it apart. But is that enough? The short answer is, I don't think so. Rage 2 takes place about 30 years after the original, where a number of arcs containing cryogenically preserved survivors were activated and set loose upon the wasteland. Life has returned to the barren deserts that once existed, and the population has flourished while the, imaginatively named Authority forces were driven underground. With their resurgence, players are put in control of Walker, the last Ranger, whose goal is to wipe the Authority forces out once and for all. While still as generic and bland as its predecessor's narrative, I've got to give credit where credit is due. Rage 2 does at least give your character clear motivations right from the beginning. Beyond that, the story isn't overly engaging, but does serve as a decent enough vehicle for gameplay, even if the wild and wacky attitude found in the game's pre-release marketing doesn't really seep into the narrative at all. The game does feature one or two interesting characters that spice up its plot, but for the most part they're in short supply. Overall, the cast are brought to life through solid voice work, but there just isn't a lot going on with most of the characters. Sam Riegel's performance as the male lead is pretty enjoyable, and the bandit clans in the Waste sound about as vicious and crazed as you'd expect, so there's really nothing to complain about at the very least. The rest of Rage 2's audio is a bit more interesting, with most of the game's action accompanied by grungy rock tracks with particularly intense percussion. It fits well with the over-the-top vibe that Rage 2 is obviously aiming for as a whole, and even though it can be drowned out by the constant gunfire and explosions of the game's more action-packed sequences, it's hard to argue that the soundtrack doesn't fit perfectly. To be honest, these action sequences might just be enough to carry the game entirely. Unfortunately, I found that too many other, less entertaining elements of Rage 2 tended to get in the way. At its core, Rage 2 is an open-world shooter, and when it drops you into a gunfight, it truly shines. The core gunplay feels responsive and fast, and simply shooting enemies was surprisingly satisfying thanks to liberal splashes of blood and colourful resources flying out of dead bandits like they were meaty piñatas. There's also something to be said for games that flash a little red skull on screen as a hit marker as well. But what's a shooter without an awesome variety of radical guns? Thankfully, Rage 2 has you covered with an assortment of projectile implements to further the pain and suffering of others with. You've got your basics, your pistol, shotgun, assault rifle and rocket launcher, as well as some more unique armaments. We're talking grav dart guns, which shoot darts that can then fling your enemies in a chosen direction, revolvers that shoot bullets that combust on command, as well as two flavors of energy weapon, one for rapid fire and one for single massive damage shots. But not to be outdone, Rage 2's less insane weaponry featured their own unique quirks to keep them from feeling like weapons from every other game. The rocket launcher can lock onto targets and shoot swarms of missiles at once, while the pistol alternates between single and burst fire while shooting from the hip and from iron sights respectively. With all that said though, I found myself falling back on the reliable duo of the shotgun and the assault rifle. The assault rifle probably has the least to talk about out of all the weapons on offer, but it's a good all-rounder which you'll almost always have ammo for. But the shotgun? Its primary fire from the hip is a solid shotgun blast, while its iron sights fire will blast enemies back with a massive force push, and it is awesome! Whatever else I have to say about this game, it may have my new favourite video game shotgun. To Rage 2's credit, it really does double down on making you an unstoppable killing machine. On top of the solid selection of weapons, it gives you a few side weapons to whip out which are fine. The wing stick is really cool once you upgrade it to the point where it auto-tracks consistently, but it's hard to get excited about grenades and drones when your shotgun force pushes guys 15 meters back, you know? Much more exciting are your unlockable abilities and the overdrive mode you get from the outset. The overdrive mode functions as a sort of rage mode from other action games. In fact, not calling it a rage mode seems like a missed opportunity. Anyway, when you kill enough enemies to fill this meter, activating it will let you boost your damage output and let you heal over time. It's accompanied by this pretty intense neon flare-up and chromatic aberration, and it makes you feel pretty invincible. The various powers you can unlock also add a bit more variety to your gunfights, ranging from mobility options like double jumps and dashes, to more offensive skills like ground pounds and slams which, true to form, feel very satisfying to perform as you blast enemies to pieces with your bare hands. There are one or two of these skills that just don't feel as useful, but on the whole it's hard to be upset with the amount of options that Rage 2 gives you, especially since your weapons and skills are all upgradable in one form or another. It is a little disappointing then that the rest of the game just doesn't really live up to Rage 2's combat. The other big focus of the game is on racing and driving around the wasteland, which is at best functional and at worst kind of a pain in the ass. Vehicles handle unpredictably, with steering alternating between unresponsive and way too damn sensitive within seconds of each other. And driving most things that aren't your primary vehicle just doesn't make sense because they all handle like shit, but your default car is one of the only ones you'll find with weapons. Speaking of, vehicular combat is fine for the most part, ruined only by the fact that you have to, drive the game's vehicles while partaking in it. Weapons auto-aim for the most part, and trying to target specific things can be a little bit fiddly, but if you completely ignore the lackluster driving, then reveling in Mad Max-style car combat is fine. No joke, the driving is such a pain that as soon as I got a vehicle that allowed me to take to the skies, I almost exclusively used that. It was fast, and I didn't have to worry about shitty steering. And that's pretty much what Rage 2 has to offer in a mechanical sense, applying these elements to the familiar trappings found in every open-world game released these days. You've got convoys to take down, bandit camps and mutant nests to clear out, and various other locations to complete various objectives at, with each one littered with various collectibles that the game lists out for you as you arrive on the scene. And this is fine, as long as the game has enemies to throw in your general direction, but eventually, you clear these out, and all you're left with is the boring 15 minutes at each location where you search every corner for the random bullshit on the game's checklist that still needs to be found. You can make this somewhat easier with an in-game radar that can be unlocked, but it still feels like a chore that needs to be done, at least if you're like me and don't like leaving a location half-finished. My biggest disappointment with Rage 2 is that the game rests far too heavily on its repetitive open-world content. In total, the game offers up less than 10 unique core story missions, some of which require you to raise the renown of the mission givers to actually progress the story by doing side content. In total, I'd say that while I spent 16 hours playing this game, 12 of those hours were spent clearing locations in the wasteland, and 4 hours or so, if I'm being generous, were spent actually following the main story. Not that it was particularly compelling, but these missions were at least more interesting than clearing out another bandit camp, you know? Not content to simply pad out the game, most of Rage 2's more interesting combat mechanics, its weapons and powers, are locked behind a handful of these open-world points of interest, meaning that not only can you finish the campaign without ever unlocking over half of Rage 2's tools, but practically all of the game can be completed with just the base assault rifle and shotgun. There are no challenges that make your combat abilities or weapons feel particularly necessary, and even basic shit like the double jump and dash don't have a lot of unique applications beyond making things easier or quicker. It doesn't help that most of these locations all look like the same rundown, dusty ruins with neon lights, assorted junk, and graffiti slapped onto them either. Rage 2 is by no means a bad looking game, but once you've seen an hour or so of it, you've seen most of it. It obviously looks much more clean and crisp than its predecessor, and it at least gives you some different, non-desert biomes to explore, but that's about the nicest thing I can say about Rage 2's visuals. The game still experiences some slight texture pop-in from time to time, though much less than that seen in Rage 1, but there are some other weird visual quirks that just rub me the wrong way. I know this is going to come off as petty, but who the hell releases a game in 2019 without some kind of brightness slider, huh? Thanks to the game's obsession with making you search locations for random stuff, I spent a disproportionate amount of time scouring dark corners for these things, and not being able to see shit was kind of annoying as it turns out. For the most part, the game is bright enough that this isn't necessarily an issue, but certain indoor areas or areas at night can be pretty straining on the eyes. It's weird because the game does have options for other visual effects, like the amount of chromatic aberration. It's just genuinely baffling. So with all that said, Rage 2 is mediocre. Really, if Rage 2 was just a series of endless challenge rooms and corridors where you had a constant onslaught of enemies to take out, I would definitely be much more keen on the game. When you're in combat, Rage 2 is really enjoyable, but so much of my time with the game was spent scrounging for collectibles after a fight, driving between fights, and doing the game's busy work to enable more options for the fights. The story, while generic, is a damn sight better than its predecessor, but there just wasn't much in the way of unique missions to spice the game up, or give you a reason to do anything. Like I said, if you mainline this game and do it well, you can get it done in about a third of the time. Also, there are microtransactions for skins? I think? It's unclear, but fuck microtransactions. If you're looking for a solid shooter, then Rage 2 will get the job done, and it's another okay checklist game, but not much more.